Welcome to Corelight Defenders. I'm Richard Bejtlich, strategist and author-in-residence at Corelight. In each episode, we explore insights from the front lines of NDR, network detection and response. And today I am speaking with Vern Paxson, our co-founder and chief scientist at Corelight. Welcome, Vern.
Happy to be here. This will be fun.
The topic we decided to speak about involves covert channels. How do you think about covert channels? What are we talking about?
Yeah, so a covert channel is a way for an adversary to communicate. So there's a system that they have access to, and then let's say the external world, and they want to communicate between them. And what makes it covert is looking at the traffic, it's not apparent that the communication is happening. So there are a whole lot of ways of doing this. For example, in web requests, there are headers that the web browser sends to the web server and in the other direction that describe all sorts of stuff. What's the language settings and what's the time zone and, zillions of these. The attacker, if they control the browser and the server, could add headers that have some sort of benign looking name and some sort of encoded information that they want to communicate. The server knows where to look for these and how to decipher whatever's put in the header. Any network monitoring or analysis of server logs or whatever will just see some header and say, darned if I know what that is. There's so many different ways of doing this. Most of them are sort of catnip to certain types of academics who just want to bat out yet another incremental form of cleverness. So they think, hey, there's a covert channel you can do with TCP options or with size of SSH randomness or whatever it is. There's many, many of these. Most of them kind of miss the point that if the attacker controls both the client and the server, there's more straightforward ways they can communicate, like just put it all inside encrypted TLS session and be done with it. Often it's viewed as a theoretical interest. However, there's some forums that actually really matter. These arise when you've got a lockdown environment, like an enterprise that really tries to control communication between its internal systems and the internet, and is able to sort of scrub most of the traffic that goes out. For example, they might use web proxies so that all the HTTP headers that I talked about earlier in the web connections, they just strip them out because they're going to regenerate that connection from scratch. So in that context, covert channels can matter a lot. And the one that I want to talk about is used in practice and can really matter, which is using the DNS name lookups that at enterprises, there's millions of these a day. In a lookup, an internal system will ask an intermediary system that's also owned by the enterprise, please look up this name, like, www.goodguys.com. And that resolver, the internal system, will in turn generate a query for it, get back the reply, which is often like an IP address, and forward that along to the internal system. That's a very limited form of communication that the enterprise allows and motivates attackers to figure out how to bury inside those names the communication they want.
These matter to the intruder when there's a belief that the intruder could be caught by someone. If no one is watching, if no one is collecting any evidence, then the need to use a covert channel reduces drastically. So we're talking about environments where someone actually is paying attention, right?
Exactly. So the case where there's no monitoring is very easy for the attacker. The case where this matters is the enterprise that's been subverted by this attacker really runs a tight ship, and generally that's because they've got lots of important stuff to secure.
I'm glad that you addressed the issue of breaking the direct connection from the client and the server if both sides are controlled by the intruder. There's a lot of work that's been done over the years of, like you said, using these weird TCP options or flipping a bit or using some unused part of a header. And if you don't have clear end-to-end communication between those two systems, if there's any type of middle box, it's going to do any type of rewriting, even if it's simple NAT. that's just going to go out the window usually. So a lot of those
Exactly.
just get solved by having, in some ways it's a pain but there are so many middle boxes. That's not kind of what the internet was set up to be, but at the same time, it does break some of those covert channels. But let's talk about the DNS stuff now. So I think lots of people could imagine how that could work. You ask something very simple. You ask to resolve a certain domain, you get something back, and that could mean something. But can you tell me more about how this might work and what the research you did looked at?
Yeah, sure. And I like how you put it about, essentially the question is how many degrees of freedom does the attacker have? And in a enterprise where there are all these middle boxes, that greatly reduces the attacker's degrees of freedom. In DNS, what they have is the name they look up and when they look it up. And there's one other detail, which is there's a type, like you could say, hey, I want IP address or I want alias for it or whatever. And for our purposes, let's just consider that part of the name because it doesn't change any of the overall thinking. First, the situation we went after, which is a common one, is the attacker controls a remote name server that is, let's say, kittens.com, and lookups to kittens.com will come to that server and the attacker can see them there. The internal system that wants to, and generally we're going to care about exfiltration in this context, wants to send a bunch of data out to the attacker will do lookups to kittens.com. And I chose that name because the point is the name itself of which the subdomains are being looked up seems benign. And so the enterprise can't a priori go, I've got a problem internally. Someone's looking up kittens.com because they don't know that it's malicious. The attacker can do quite a few things. So the most basic thing would be to look up, the first a name that is base64 encoding, so some sort of ASCII readable thing of the first 100 bytes. That would be this big long line of goop.kittens.com, and then the next 100 bytes, big long series of goop.kittens.com, and just keep looking these up. And as the attacker observes these coming in, they're able to just line them all up, assemble them into the overall item that they want to exfiltrate. There's other ways that these lookups can be used, which are a little more subtle. Basically, there are two additional degrees of freedom. One of them is you can look up names repeatedly and actually convey some information. And I'll give a simple example. You might pick 8 colors, orange, blue, green, etc. And which color you look up determines 3 bits because there's out of 8 possibilities, there's 3 bits that describes which of the 8 you chose. And so you can keep looking those up over and over and leak out information that way. That's a lower capacity channel. You don't use all of the potential information that you're sending, but it's trickier to understand that something sneaky might be going on because the repeated lookups just seem like harmless, So the thing ought to cache and it doesn't and keeps looking up the same name. Finally, you can use the timing of the lookups to kittens.com. So you could just look up over and over www.kittens.com, which seems so benign. But the communication can be resolved in terms of, well, what was the spacing between those, say, in tens of milliseconds? And if it was between 1 millisecond and 1,000, well, that's essentially 10 bits of information if the attacker is able to resolve the timing that precisely. So those are 3 different ways of using the channel.
How does having all your DNS requests go to a local name server that does caching and all that, how does that affect the situation?
Yeah, so for the first case where you're encoding information directly, typically caching won't matter because you're not going to look up the same thing multiple times. For the cases where you're repeating the sort of codebook style or the timing one, DNS allows replies to have a cacheability, essentially a cache lifetime. And so the attacker's name server could just say, hey, this one's not cacheable. and then it won't be cached, and the requests will still go out even though they're redundant.
That makes me wonder, could that be something you look for is when every response that comes back says, don't cache this. At the same time,
Yeah,
I'm wondering,
exactly. So,
does a
so
CDN do that, or I don't know.
let me then move into how we went after this, because this was sort of an epic undertaking between my students at UC Berkeley, folks on my research team at the International Computer Science Institute in Berkeley, and folks at IBM Research. And we spent about 2 years on this problem, and came up with a nice solution that I'll get to in a bit. But so the starting point is, hey, these all sound kind of weird. You know, you're going to have really big names being looked up that kind of look like gobbledygook, or you're going to have names looked up that have no cacheability. So just look for that. And our approach was we had access to tons of data, which is the style of research that I really thrive on and love. And what I love about having tons of data, and here I'm talking enterprise data, is the world is often way more complex and messier than you might expect. And I love being surprised, even when the surprise is, darn it, the easy thing doesn't work. The first thing we did was analyze, hey, surely you don't see lookups for like 100 character long names very often at all. And it turns out, no, you see like, 50,000 a day. So you're like, that's going to be tough to do that. Or surely you don't see uncacheable things. No, that happens all the time. And so those natural signals, when you understand how the communication might be happening and want to go after its quirks, the quirks occur for benign reasons a great deal, and do not give you a solid basis to proceed. In addition, a lot of this problem boils down to, what's the attacker? How patient is the attacker? Because they might not look up, 100-byte names over and over to convey 100 bytes at a time. They might look up 5-byte names and convey 5 bytes at a time. And if they do that, now you no longer have any signal for, hey, the name is really long. You might have the names are diverse. There's quite a few different ones. And we looked at that, and that's also common. And that's really the key to the problem, is realizing you cannot solve it perfectly. And the thought experiment for that I like is each day, maybe they look up www.kittens.com, maybe they don't. If they do, it's a 1-bit. If they don't, it's a 0-bit. And there's no way you're ever going to figure out, hey, they're very slowly leaking out, a bit a day in that fashion. You cannot win that. When you've got that realization, then you can actually start thinking about, okay, what interesting subset of this problem can we solve? The one we went after was, okay, you've got a bound, and you want to confine the attacker to, they have an upper bound on how much information they can exfiltrate, say, every day. And you'll just accept that if they're below the bound, they win. But if they're above it, you'll find them. And the bound we used for our evaluations was either 4 kilobytes a day or 10 kilobytes a day. Those both seem really quite good. If you've got a serious exfil concern, often the thing being exfiltrated is megabytes, and the attacker is not going to be able to persist for years to exfiltrate that. So they're going to have to go above these limits. Is this making sense how I'm sketching it?
Yes. Can you think of something valuable that could be stolen in a very small amount? I'm thinking maybe credentials.
Exactly.
But aside from that, I don't know.
Crypto goop of various sorts is certainly a biggie there. And you can imagine other things like the malware figures out, hey, the company's going to go public soon. You should, some small amount of information that can be leveraged into a large external gain.
Okay.
But we're not solving that problem. We wish we could. We don't solve it. But we do solve it when it's, hey, it's the plans for the fighter plane or whatever, something big that when one thinks about exfil, that's often what's being exfiltrated is, a database of something.
Or even just sustained command and control where you're issuing lots of commands and getting a lot of responses and you're trying to figure out how to move around in an enterprise. That's happening over obfuscated channel like this.
Yes.
That could trigger your threshold.
Yes, as soon as like what you need to exfiltrate is a screenshot or just here's a list of all the systems or whatever it is, you'll pretty rapidly use up that budget.
That is all for part 1 of my interview with Vern Paxson on covert channels. In part 2, Vern will describe the system he and his fellow researchers used in production networks to find DNS-based covert channels. Thank you for joining us on the Network Defenders podcast, sponsored by Corelight. We will see you on the network.
You've been listening to Corelight Defenders. To stay informed with expert intelligence on today's cybersecurity challenges, please subscribe to ensure you never miss an episode. We'll see you on the network.